School districts can be highly variable, and you can get a lot of pushback depending on which school district you're in, or even if it's a charter school or a non-charter. And so there's a lot of different legal loopholes, and some things are a little bit more strict than others. So knowing that, I think, is handy. The first piece, though, is just the terminology and timelines. And I feel like just when you start trying to work on integrating care between primary care and mental health, you realize we have all different kinds of acronyms and meanings and things that don't make sense to one another. It is just as goofy with schools, if not more so. So the first part is FERPA. And FERPA, if you're not familiar with it, is basically HIPAA for schools. So it's all of the things that protect the educational record, confidentiality and privacy, along with all of those nuances about who's allowed to get what and what kinds of permissions. And it's very complicated, but very similar to HIPAA. The thing that's nice to know with FERPA is that under that, a school has 45 days maximum to produce the educational record if it's requested. So if a parent wants a copy of a record or wants a copy of a record to be shared with another school or with a medical professional or whoever, that school has 45 days to do so. The timelines, I'll bring them up a couple times during this because they're very important. They're actually specified in law, and it's one of the ways that people can push back to schools if they're not getting the services they want, is if the schools failed to meet the timeline, then you have some pretty quick appeal rights. So all of special education is housed under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. So the purpose of IDEA was to make sure that we're giving guarantees to the education for people with disabilities, and it's also the way in which they fund and have grants that go to states for disability education. So all of the things that relate to being on an IEP or getting special ed fall under IDEA. One of the biggest pieces of that is FAPE, the Free and Appropriate Public Education. Now, FAPE guarantees that students will be given, first of all, free and appropriate based on what their needs are, public education in the least restrictive environment. And it's a guarantee from ages 3 to 21. It's intended to very directly include those with disabilities, because those would be the people who might initially have gotten not the best or most appropriate education, but it also extends to students who have been suspended or expelled from school. So if there is an appropriate reason or what is deemed permissible reason to expel a student who has disabilities, that school district is still responsible for providing that child with an appropriate education in some different setting. So that school district ends up paying for whatever the education alternative is. IDEA also spells out what categories of disability you're covered under in order for it to be under IDEA and therefore for an IEP. There's 13. People can have more than one, but they have to have at least one, and it has to be interfering with their learning environment or their ability to learn in that environment in order to qualify under IDEA. So an IEP is then that written plan that will put together all of the pieces that ensure that that student is getting the best possible education and that they're able to continue to progress along with their peers. So it will have a statement about how the student's disability affects their involvement in the curriculum. It will also have measurable goals. It will specify all of the special education services and program modifications that'll be provided to the child, including all of the appropriate accommodations necessary to measure their academic success. So accommodations can include things like extended time, having somebody read questions aloud to you, having somebody write the answers once you respond out loud. It's anything that changes the way in which the child receives the information or reports back the information. So it's not a change in the actual content, that would be considered modification, and that's a little bit harder to get to. You'll also hear people talk about 504 plans. A 504 plan is very similar to an IEP, but it's not as strict. And it's actually housed under a whole different federal law. So where IEPs are covered under IDEA, and IDEA was a federal law intended to protect the education for people with disabilities, 504 plans are actually under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and it was intended as a civil rights law to stop discrimination against people with disabilities. So this one's a little bit different, but it can include lots of things, and it enables the school to offer accommodations that don't necessarily impact the learning, but might impact the social environment, so that these can be a little bit looser and more flexible for people. It's also why some students who don't qualify for an IEP definitely still might qualify for a 504. So, comparison. IEPs have very strict legal requirements in terms of what is included in them, who it is offered to, timelines. It is all very explicitly spelled out. 504, less so. There are some general guidelines. It varies from state to state. Way more loose. IEP has the 13 specific disabilities, and learning and attention issues may qualify, but the disability must affect the educational performance or the ability to learn. Whereas under a 504, it can be any disability, not those 13 specifically. And again, the learning or attention might apply, but it doesn't have to. And the disability must substantially limit or alter the basic life activities, which might be learning, but it's not limited to learning. So again, that's more of, if a kid is having some social anxiety issues and they're still learning well, but they're not progressing socially, that would be a problem, so that you can get a 504 for that. A 504 has no standardized format. It, in fact, doesn't even have to be written, which to me seems like not a good idea. Having things in writing with your schools is very important, because otherwise you don't have a whole lot of guarantees. But technically a 504 plan does not have to be a written document. Whereas an IEP is always a written document. There is a very specific format that must be followed, and every little box in there has to be checked. An IEP is almost like your treatment plan, but for the learning instead of whatever the medical issue is. The IEP also has set learning goals and describes the services that the school has to provide. Once they are written in the IEP, the school is obligated to provide all of those services and obligated to provide documentation that they are doing those services as they're spelled out. So if a child is supposed to receive accommodations for some type of, where they have to have the prompt for a writing assignment read out loud to them, that has to be done every time, and teachers have to document how they're doing that. If they have to modify the educational level for every assignment for 1 or 2 students, they have to do that for every assignment. And they have to be able to show the intervention specialist, person in charge of special ed, how they're doing that, because the state does ask. One of the things that's, I think, very important to remember is that schools get extra money. So schools always get a set amount per student. For every one of those disability categories, they get extra money. They get a lot of extra money if the disability category is autism or multiple disabilities. Opposed to 504, they don't get any extra money for that, and they can't use their IDEA IEP funds to service the students with 504 plans. However, if they are refusing to comply with 504 plans and they're not offering them to parents, they can actually then lose money. So in order to get an IEP, and this is very specific to IEPs because, again, the 504 is way more loose. And if you went through this eligibility evaluation process and weren't eligible for an IEP, that might be the time that you'd say, well, let's do a 504 plan instead. But from the time that a parent asks for it, and I always encourage parents, put it in writing, because then you have proof. they have 60 calendar days to comply with that written request for an evaluation. And the evaluation is going to be pretty extensive. They should be asking for medical records, if it's, if the child is involved with counseling or psychiatry or has seen a neurologist, any type of that information is completely eligible. They should be asking for all of it. They should be interviewing the parents and the kids. They should be interviewing the teachers, looking at historical data. They should be observing the child in the classroom when the child doesn't know that they specifically are being observed, particularly if it's a behavior thing. You want somebody just to hop into the classroom and watch the whole class, even though their eye's on Johnny. They also can be using a variety of standardized assessments, and depending on which disability, those standardized assessments are going to vary. But things like intelligence testing, adaptive behavior skills, rating scales for ADHD, but whatever would be considered appropriate and research-based within the literature for that particular issue. All of this then comes into an ETR, which is the evaluation team report, which again is a very structured summary of all of this information, but that ETR is what then builds the IEP. Again, timelines, super important, and these are the things that parents, I think, get themselves into a tricky spot with, is they have 30 days to develop the IEP from the point that that child is determined eligible. So if you have your ETR report today, then you have 30 calendar days to have that IEP in place. That's 90 calendar days from receiving the parental consent for the evaluation, or 120 calendar days from the request for the evaluation. But it has to be the shortest of whichever is applicable. So they are bound to do this in a fairly short period of time. And I don't ever feel bad about that because they get a lot of extra money to do it, and it is their obligation. So the other piece, other than just being able to educate our parents and kids, that I find very interesting is kind of the social justice equity aspect of IEPs and the way that schools tend to handle behavior. When you look into the actual body of the law under IDEA, they knew even then that there was a disparity between the number of students who are minority status who are being identified for special ed and not, and it's never been a proportional rate, even when you consider what the population is. So you still have to start to wonder, how is this being assessed, and is it being assessed in an equitable way? It's gotten so bad, in fact, that we now have moved to where the state is updating things because of significant disproportionality. So in 1998 to 1999, Black kids represented just about 15% of the population, but it was 20% of all of the children identified with disabilities. That's actually jumped significantly. So in 2012, minority students, so I guess that's more than just the Black population, but still it's 40 to 90% of them being identified with intellectual or emotional disabilities. And Black children were also twice as likely as their white counterparts to be identified as having an emotional disturbance. So that doesn't exactly make sense if you've got, a huge portion of your small Black population being identified as having intellectual disabilities or emotional disturbances. It's not statistically kosher. What makes it worse is that when they have actually looked at it, schools that are predominantly white and have predominantly white teachers have a disproportionately high number of their minority students pushed into special education. Granted, there's nothing in the literature that says why, but that does seem on its face not appropriate. And when you actually look into a bigger picture of the data, actually 70% of the students involved with school-related arrests or court referrals are Black or Hispanic. So what we really see is this kind of interesting conundrum of we've got, first Black students and minority students being pushed into a lot of special ed, but then a lot of them also being disproportionately expelled and suspended. So we've got a huge portion of special ed, but now we've got 18% of the population. This was from a New York Times study. And out of the 18% of that population, there were 35% of those who had been suspended and 39% of those who had been expelled. And this was even in preschoolers. So 18% of the student population, but half of all of the suspensions. I cannot even imagine what you would suspend a preschooler for, honestly. So this is this is where it gets interesting and tricky and starts to really overlap. So we have a pattern of criminalizing or medicalizing behavior in children. And there was a study that actually looked at this, and it was a fairly large study, and I can offer that article if you were interested in it. Schools with larger Black populations had higher rates of suspension and expulsion, so criminalizing, and lower rates of students on an IEP or 504. If you take race out of the mix, that same trend is seen in schools that have more poverty. So really you have this combination of if in a poor school district and Black, your likelihood of being suspended, expelled, or arrested continues to exponentially grow. And they've seen this across the board. So yeah, I guess my takeaway is structural racism, it continues to impact our schools in ways that is disturbing. And outside of that, IEPs and the medicalizing of children's behavior in the classroom, and when it can't be medicalized, then it ends up being criminalized, is I think something that I've always been passionate about advocating about. There are a lot of people who succeed if they're given the right education. And there are a lot of people who are able to do many great things with their lives if we keep them out of the criminal justice system. I didn't include any of the data, but I know that there is some initiative within the country about 3 Days Matter. And being picked up and arrested from a school would be traumatizing and then sets those kids on a trajectory that they didn't need to be on when they could have been given an IEP and some wraparound services and been able to pull themselves together in a fairly successful way. And there is a little video link, and I'll make sure that you guys get the slides so you can catch that video link. But actually Jamie shared that video with me about a young man who had, I'm sorry, Jamie, she really just gave me the look for like, I don't know what video you're talking about, but
I want to see the other video you're saying.
A talk about a young man who had been told his entire life that he was not smart, not good enough, and then finally had a teacher say, no, I believe in you, you could do this, and is now giving talks. So kids can succeed, but if we believe that they're going to be unable and we start getting that message in their head, it tends to stay there.